Hi, today let's discuss whether green growth will save the planet. Admittedly, that's a bit of a clickbait title, but it's a very topical and important issue because you may have seen a graph like this one, which for one country or several countries, here it's Germany, shows you that our income level, our GDP per capita is increasing, whereas CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions have started to decline, something we call decoupling. And the story goes that this is happening in several countries. Most recently, China has joined that club in 24-25, and that therefore we would be on good track that we can make green growth and still continue what we're doing without making any commitments, additional commitments to climate change. And I want to break that down for you today in this short clip. And in order to understand what's going on, let's recall we have output increasing, and if we think about that from a production function, we see that fossil resources are declining, right? Both is going on at the same time. So this means that emission efficiency, which we could label alpha X, is increasing. And in some cases, I may not want to work with this production function, or I may not be able to specify it. So what I could do is I could say, well, let's look at emissions. That's what we're interested in, right? And in this case, emissions per capita that come from fossil resources. And let's investigate how they depend on output or GDP per capita. And this would give us this regression equation 2. And the central parameter here is beta. Beta tells me if output per capita goes up by 1 percentage point, by how many percent are emissions per capita increasing. So in other words, a low beta would mean a high emission efficiency. And let's get back to the graph of Germany and what that would mean. You see here GDP per capita relative in percentage terms to the starting value in the late 19th century. And the other series is also compared to that starting value, the annual CO2 per capita emissions. And after World War II, you're seeing that both of them increase at roughly the same magnitudes. So here you would have a beta that is more or less equal to 1, right? So any increase in economic activity is at the same time leading to the same increase in proportionate terms in CO2 emissions. What's happening after the 1960s is the following, that this relationship is still positive, but not as strong anymore. So that's a period we call, or I would call, relative decoupling. So the beta declines over time, and at some point in the 1980s or 1990s, we even see a period where we continue to grow, but emissions start to come down. So after that period, my beta, or our beta, or the beta of Germany, has come to a negative value. And that's something we observe in several countries, and that people test econometrically a lot, because you will also see that in the context of the environmental Kuznets curve, as you may have already suspected. This is now all the countries we have for 2023, and the slope of this Kuznets curve, this environmental Kuznets curve, well, that slope is our beta. So you see that the beta for poor countries is higher than the beta for high income countries, right? So the slope of these of this curve is declining the more I move to the richer countries. That's characteristic of a concave curve. And at some point I may observe a turning point where the slope is 0, and beyond that turning point my slope would be smaller than 0, right? So this is connecting the decoupling idea to the environmental Kuznets curve. But all of that helps us understand what's going on in the relationship between production and emissions. But of course, let's not forget one thing. We're not caring in the end about beta itself and how statistically significant it is. All that matters for our climate is global emissions, and therefore it's relevant what's going on in countries like Germany, France, the United States, China, which now all have a very small or negative beta. But we have to look at what happens in the whole world, right? And this is the most important thing for our climate, because the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere overall, that's what's leading to global warming. And if you look at that series, global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions for the whole world, you see that this has continuously risen for the last decades or even centuries. And you could now say, well, now it's peaking, and that may be true, we don't know that. And maybe it starts to decline at some point, and even that we don't know. But the question is how fast, right? So people that tell you, well, we have some countries with a negative beta, well, they don't realize that it's about economic magnitudes, not p-values of t-statistics. So this point here is more or less our starting point. That's the point of total emissions we are facing around 2021 or 22. And the question is, can we get to an emission trajectory which makes sure that our world is not heating up to a level where mankind will not be able to survive? And you see with current policies, that was in 2022, or even the pledges and targets back then, which is more realistic for us going forward, even then we're quite far away from where we have to be to ensure that mankind will be able to survive on our planet. And that's all that matters. It's the global level of greenhouse gas emissions and not the t-statistics of your small sample. So let me wrap that up for you. Global emissions, that's what's counting. Yes, the beta is important because it tells us how economic activity feeds into emissions. But as soon as you realize that this beta is not low enough, you have to start thinking, okay, what else can we do to bring down those emissions? One option is, of course, less population, but that's something which from a moral perspective and a practical perspective is very problematic and difficult. So the only thing that matters here, or the only thing that's left, is unfortunately our per capita income level. And of course, we don't want to lower that. Income levels determine how healthy we are, whether we can feed our kids, whether we can stay in a heated home, etc. And especially in poor countries, it's very hard to imagine that we tell China or India or Vietnam or Ethiopia to stop growing, right? Because some of these countries still have many people living in absolute poverty or close to that. So we want to make sure that their income per capita level rises. So on a final note, I want to remind you that the average income level of a country is the sum over all individual incomes, right? Divided by the population there. And this income is very highly unequally distributed within countries. And you may therefore raise the question whether some people have higher emission intensity in their consumption baskets than other people, and that's something we'll look at in the context of emission inequality in a separate video. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think in the comments.